as a site of, and here's the key phrase, a site of contestation. A site of contestation between great powers. Now, this is not obviously a historic phenomenon. As we discussed previously, Southeast Asian politics really until the early part of the 19th century, until the early 1800s, was dominated apparently by one very, very large actor. That country would be China, which had played the role of regional hegemon. If I use the word hegemon, I'm also not aware of who's done it. Well, let's just do it by show of hands. Who's taken Introduction to International Relations? Reasonable. Okay, we'll make sure we have the vocabulary down as we go, just in case. Also, it's a useful review to reinforce these concepts. So China, Imperial China, under the dynasties lasting until 1911, played the role of regional, saints preserve us. I'll fix the lighting in a second. Hegemon. In other words, a state which exerts hegemony over a particular region. What is hegemony, please? Close enough. What's hegemony, please? Or what is a hegemon? What's it? It's a fancy word for something quite basic. Oh, yes?
Controlling power.
Control power, even more simply, an influence or an influencer. You know those annoying people that post things like on Instagram, and it's like, oh, they're an Instagram influencer. It's like, oh, so you have no real marketable skills or talent or real any taste. Yes, hegemon is the country version of this. And China historically had become the regional hegemon for thousands and thousands of years, intervening within the domestic politics of these countries, intervening within their disputes, engaging in trade, and generally acting in a manner contrary to popular belief that was relatively benign overall in terms of preserving security and in terms of ensuring that these states were able to fundamentally develop and stable form of governance. Ultimately, this begins to change with what? With the entry of, sorry, I swear I don't have coronavirus. 50-50 shot. Sorry. Oh, Tinley, tell the airport, start scanning people. For the love of God, use that temperature thing. It's pretty bad.
Yeah,
they really should be doing it.
They do.
Not yesterday, they were. I was a little bit shocked. Ultimately, we saw, of course, in the 1800s and the early 20th century, we saw the entry of European colonialism. We saw the spread of several particular empires controlling particular territories. Just as a sake of review, French Empire controlled which three countries? Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Vietnam, particularly Saigon, being the center and core of the French Empire. Next up, United Kingdom. British colonies include Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, and one more over. Myanmar, yes, Myanmar. Thailand maintains its independence. The only country in Southeast Asia so to do, acting as what between the British and French empires? A buffer state, fundamentally. We also have two other maritime empires. These include the United States with control over, gained in which conflict? Spanish-American War. And of course, the Netherlands in charge of. And finally, we have one teeny tiny European power that has two teeny tiny colonies that remain from its heyday as the world's greatest trading post empire. Those would be what colonies and what empire? Portugal. They lose Malacca in the 1500s. Good try though. Macau. And the most recent member of ASEAN. What's that? East Timor. Timor-Leste, East Timor. Don't forget them. In Cambodia, I go to church with their ambassador. She's very nice. So don't forget East Timor. And ultimately, we see that following the close of World War II, we see Southeast Asia become deeply embroiled in the politics of the Cold War. A locus of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, obviously with the role of China playing something of a proxy until the Sino-Soviet split of 1973. Obviously, this is seen most obviously in the histories of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Deaths of 2.5 million Vietnamese, 55,000 Americans. The fall of the government of South Vietnam in April of 1975, of Cambodia in March of 1975, and 6 months later, the government of the Kingdom of Laos. Obviously today, Laos and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam remain under these same regimes. Now, at the end of the Cold War, in the early 1990s, the general view was, this is it. We're into a unified Southeast Asia. There is no longer a concern over great power conflict, and we saw the expansion of what regional entity in the 1990s to incorporate the CLMV states, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which of course is established by the Treaty of Bangkok in 1967 to strengthen the states that were essentially bulwarks against communism. And the assumption was that the expansion of ASEAN would fulfill economic integration, but also very importantly, would be useful in terms of confidence building and decreasing regional tension. On page 216, the author provides us with a brief discussion of the great powers in Southeast Asia, 216 to 221. Would anyone, while I enjoy a bite of macaroni and cheese because I've noticed this far in, a chance to summarize the discussion provided by Andrew T.H. Tan on page 216. I can wait, I have macaroni and cheese. What's his point? Why do we care? Andrew's a pretty smart guy.
I remember that this one was more about like security in general in Southeast Asia.
Yep.
It's a little hard to wrap up just because like everybody has wildly different interests.
Absolutely.
Like not even the states. Like you can't point at a state and be like, we know what they want.
Yeah.
Because so much is also happening within or like between groups.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard to.
How so? Can you provide us with an example, please?
I mean, like something that comes to my mind is like with Zomia, you have like lots of different like people groups, and like getting people on board with something like that.
Well, yes, we have the fact that we have both multi-ethnic states in certain contexts, and that does obviously provide questions as to the national interest, as to how the national interest of a particular state is defined. The general issues that we see in terms of the history of the region, the general issues of insecurity. So one of the great questions as noted before is, why has Southeast Asia been peaceful since the 1990s, and where is it likely to go? And to scroll back all the way, I suppose, to the introduction, where we can then begin to flesh this out a little bit, is seeing Southeast Asia again as, I mean, sort of like, really, we're gonna have to suffer through this nightmare all over again, is a renewed sight of between the United States and the People's Republic of China. That of all locations on the planet, this is essentially where we see competition for allies, competition for hegemony, and the expectation that security is most threatened here. And as we're going to discuss in a few moments, probably a little bit after the break, the broad question of the South China Sea and the role of the South China Sea in China's question of its own defense. and try to take a perspective on it that's a little bit less America-centric. The American perspective on China tends to be remarkably viewing China from the perspective of viewing it from the United States towards China, where in fact, if you view it from Beijing, things are a little bit different in terms of the challenges that China faces, China's own security, and it helps us to understand China's perception of its own particular national interests. Now, Alice Ba, in the subsequent chapter, chapter 14, gives us a nice question about the issue of asymmetry and so on and so forth in history, and that's relatively straightforward in terms of simply the sheer size of China and the historic pull that it's had over the course of the region. But today we look at the question of the contemporary push and pull of Chinese power, discussed on page 232 to 235. She makes a few main points. Could someone please run us through it? Again, I have macaroni, so I can wait. It's not very good. It's from Sodexo, what do you expect?
So kind of her main 2 points are that China is really close geographically.
Yes.
And then China has a huge economic power and pull, and they not only help as a consumer market, but they also help with aid. And especially during the financial aid crisis, they contributed a lot to the ASEAN region, helping them get out of the recessions that they were in. And so with those two, there's lots of pull towards China,
Yeah.
which concerns the US.
Precisely. Let me run you through a few different examples, a few sort of key timeline moments as to China's role in the region and how it's developed historically. The Asian financial crisis of the 1990s. China really, and for about a decade and a half, constantly referenced the Asian financial crisis. When the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98 was at its peak, China did not devalue its currency. It did not, for various and sundry economic reasons we don't need to get into, because it's a political science class, not an economics class. China essentially acted as a very responsible member of the global community in terms of trying to facilitate and support economic growth within the region and broader stability. And China brought this out ad nauseum over the course of the next 10 years. Hey, remember the Asian financial crisis? We didn't do crappy things. We could have done crappy things, but we didn't. Therefore, we're a responsible power. This led into a phrase that was constantly used through the 2010s and to a lesser extent today, China's peaceful rise. China's peaceful rise. It's impossible to overstate the importance of the relatively simple fact that when you're a country of 1.3 billion people that has the second largest now economy on the planet, how terrifying your economic growth, power rise might happen to be to the neighbors. Going from relatively benign actor, state that focused internally, yeah, it did communism, cultural revolution, and so on and so forth. But what it is like to live next to a country of now 1.4 billion people with the second largest military on the planet. And how often there is need for reassurance to the region as a whole, that there are, hey, there are challenges here, there are issues, there are problems, and so on and so forth. So the narrative that we saw in the 1990s and the 2000s was very much one of China's peaceful rise, and under the period of remembering our Chinese leaders since Deng Xiaoping, they would be followed by Jiang Zemin, followed by my personal favorite, Hu Jintao, followed by our good friend Xi Jinping. Memorize these names, even though they're in transliteration and not the characters. You should know who they are. They're the most important person in the world after the President of the United States is the leader of the People's Republic of China. It is vital to know who that person is, to know their responsibility, to know their job, and we'll talk about that when we get into the section on China. Now, the thing that we note is Deng Xiaoping's famous quotation. There are many. Deng Xiaoping, in my view, is the single best, most important leader of the 20th century. But Deng Xiaoping famously said, bide your time. Keep your head down. Only act when the time is right. And for somebody who survived the Cultural Revolution and then beat the Gang of Four and then went on to lead the People's Republic of China into massive economic success, pretty smart guy with pretty sound advice. And that policy of bide your time, don't show what you have, don't show off, look how powerful, look how wealthy we are, really is the essence of Chinese foreign policy in the 1990s under Jiang Zemin, and then in the 2000s under Hu Jintao. Hence the ideas of China's a responsible power. It's engaged in a peaceful rise. It wants to build a, as Hu Jintao used to say, a harmonious society, a harmonious world. The reason that we're getting so much attention to Southeast Asia under the rule of Xi Jinping is Xi Jinping's singular foreign policy strategy is called the China Dream. And the concern that is basically being constantly expressed is that as part of the China Dream, is that we could, in the question that everyone's asking, I know because I was on a panel discussion about this in July and it turned into screaming, which is fun. There was a German to basically be there to sort of moderate between me and the guy from Beijing. And he was very nice, because the guy from Beijing basically said, oh, America's Indo-Pacific is easy and controlling, and it's going to destroy Southeast Asia. And I asked to ignore my PowerPoint and respond to his arguments point by point and accuse China of revisionism. And then the German guy in between basically said, well, let me play mediator between the Americans and the Chinese. It was lots of fun. The Chinese Dream essentially relates to the question of, is China a revisionist Is China a revisionist or a status quo power? What is a revisionist power and what is a status quo power? These are technical terms for international relations theory that we should know. What's a revisionist power? What's a status quo power? Not that complex. It's not a trick question. Geez, who's ever teaching IR has got to teach it better. Please.
Putting an end to like current infrastructure sort of, so like political infrastructure.
Essentially, a status quo power is one that is content with the current equilibrium of international relations. A status quo power is a power that is content with the status quo of international relations. Again, this is one of the most important terms in international relations theory. A power that is content with the current equilibrium of international relations. Thus, when we look around the world of international relations, we look at the existing equilibrium. The United States, as the dominant hegemon, is a status quo power. Examples of countries that are not talking about China. Russia. Russia's the pretty huge perpetual example of Russia as fundamentally a revisionist power. Why might we consider to be Russia a revisionist power? It lost the Cold War. NATO expands into former Soviet space. NATO becomes, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia become countries where countries that have NATO membership. There's discussion of Ukraine entering NATO and the European Union. The US had military basing rights in Kyrgyzstan. for all intents and purposes, the end of the Cold War was a nightmare for the Soviet Union and for its long-term security. Hence, when we look at foreign policy today, if you're watching the impeachment hearings, the whole story is about Russia as a status quo power. I mean, not as a revisionist power, rather, is looking to fundamentally change the system. The $25,000 pound question for Southeast Asia and for international relations in the region is China a revisionist power, one that's seeking to alter the structure of the international system? Or is it a status quo power? Is it one that is basically accepting of the current structure and the current distribution of global power? That is the question. We know that China is becoming a quote-unquote regional hegemon. Remember, we're shifting. The reason we're in a very dangerous period in Southeast Asia is what? The system of global power is dividing. If we were talking in terms of polarity, what type of world do we live in right now? Again, simple, basic, day one of international relations. What is polarity? Or what does that mean? Why do we care about the term polarity?
Having different heavyweights of influence.
Exactly. And what kind of world do we live in today?
Unipolar.
Precisely. There are three options. I'm not sure, it's like impossible to look through this chapter without knowing this term. You can live in a unipolar world. If you're going to read foreign policy and you're an economist, you need to know this stuff. You can live in a unipolar world, i.e. a world in which there is one overwhelmingly dominant power. The world from the close of the Cold War until roughly the last few years has been a unipolar world. Dominated by the United States. Prior to that, during the course of the Cold War, we lived in a world that was a bipolar world. John Lewis Gaddis makes a wonderful argument that bipolarity is the single most stable form of global politics. It's quite a controversial argument. Gaddis is at Yale. He's one of the most prominent scholars of the history of international relations, the history of the Cold War. Prior to that, what we saw fundamentally was a multipolar world, a system with a very large number of competing, very strong powers. The question we're asking today, in tandem with the idea of, is China fundamentally a revisionist or a status quo power, is, are we still in a unipolar world? Have we shifted to a world of bipolarity, or have we shifted to a world of multipolarity? Why do we care about that? Because that is when things become dangerous. It's not when you're in a happy, stable bipolar system or a happy, stable unipolar system. The challenge occurs during the transition. So, using that vocabulary, if China is in fact a revisionist power that's seeking to build its hegemony, see what I'm doing here, reinforcing terms? If China is in fact a revisionist power seeking to build its hegemony within Southeast Asia, if it's moved beyond the idea of a responsible power of a peaceful rise, has moved into a new era under Xi Jinping, focused upon the idea of the China dream, and is ultimately seeking to build a world of multipolarity or bipolarity, what evidence might we see that would support that particular conclusion? South China Sea. There we go. See the documentary. It's relevant. Shockingly enough. The South China Sea, one example. I'm going to do a list and then we're going to go through regions. What else?
It's political structure of like Cambodia and other states in the region.
Yeah. Expanding, essentially. We're going to talk about that. Hegemony within Southeast Asia.
Consider they're also spreading their influence to Africa and different other.
Yeah, globally, we have a China that's not acting just as a regional power, and I love that you brought this one up because it's really fascinating. China is not just a regional power, because remember, if you're talking about a system of polarity, we don't talk about polarity in particular regions, we talk about global polarity, a global shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. Ergo, we have to look at the question of, well, okay, if China wants to be a global power, you can't just do Southeast Asia. You gotta do the rest of the planet too. And we're gonna take a look at that in a few other examples. Let me just put up a few others to save some time. If people wanna add a few, please let me know. The establishment of new or alternative institutions. Military modernization. (5G). Guessing you've heard about 5G. It's all over the place. Everyone talks about it. It's always, oh, China's building this new 5G system, Huawei, what's going on with Huawei? Oh, we're gonna talk about why it matters, because trust me, everyone talks about it, but nobody fully grasps why this matters. The cool thing about this section is that we're gonna go through so many misconceptualizations today that people don't realize that you'll have heard about easily if you watch the news for the next week. You're just gonna sort of burst out laughing of like, oh my God, people actually thought about this. So for, let's leave South China Sea to the end because the long one is the documentary one. I wanna go around and get people's thoughts on the documentary. Hegemony of Southeast Asia. And this goes to Ba and Beese's point, Ba and Chung Chi Kwok. Really nice guy, by the way. We saw him in October. We talked about where his kids are going to undergrad back in the States. He's desperate to find out about American universities. It's like, don't talk to me like a professor. Talk to me like a dad who's trying to figure out whether it's worth paying this amount of money to send my kid to NYU. Even academics have questions. So Southeast China's mixed a dual strategy. And how this occurs. China's aware of the question of the push and pull of Chinese power. The pull is very simple. The pull is billions of dollars of foreign direct investment. China is the single largest investor in Southeast Asia. In some cases, 3 to 4 times larger than that of any other country. I was just in Southeast Asia yesterday. I don't need to speak English or Cambodian. I can function and live my entire life in Phnom Penh in Mandarin. No problem whatsoever. I can get in a tuk-tuk or a little moto thing. I can do the transaction on my phone. I can do it basically in Chinese. I can have it stop at a Chinese market. I can basically go buy the Chinese food that I like, pay in renminbi, which is technically illegal, but everybody does it. And then walk over to the Chinese restaurant I really like, chat with the owner in Chinese, and then basically take a tuk-tuk back to my hotel, which is owned by people from mainland China, and do all of that trade, all of that interaction in Mandarin in Chinese currency. That's just tourism. That's not talking about garment factories that employ thousands and thousands of people. That's not talking about construction of trains, railways, roads. China's level of investment is simply off the charts. And we like to think that, oh, politics, yeah, it's all diverse, it's about this. No, politics is quite boring. Politics is oftentimes about money. If somebody basically shows up and offers you $500 million, you're probably gonna accept it. By the way, let's not pretend this is new. The United States did this for decades. China's not writing a new playbook. This is the system that basically the US follows. So the pull are these countries desperate to, remember, climb the ladder of production, gain foreign direct investment, build new infrastructure. And the country that's essentially there to do it, that's offering it, is the People's Republic of China. There is a $150 billion gap between the amount of money pledged and the amount of money required by 2030 to build the infrastructure required for the region's development. Where's that money coming from? Is it coming from here? Nope. Is it coming from Europe? Not remotely. It's coming from the People's Republic of China. Now, a lot of that is investment in trade. But the other big signal we see is that until 2010, it was another country that was the dominant provider of foreign direct of foreign assistance, of both foreign direct investment as well as, what's the term for official foreign aid? ODA, again, review, official development assistance. The biggest provider from really the 1960s onwards was Japan. It was Japan. Anyone, and just, we're skipping ahead a little bit to that subsequent chapter. Why? Why did Japan do it? Obviously, Japan rebuilt enormously in the 1950s and 60s, and the Japanese economic miracle is something that's simply amazing to behold. What was Japan's motivation? Discussed in the subsequent chapter by Yoshimatsu. Remember, Japan had invaded Southeast Asia, it built this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It was a creator of some of the early forms of nationalism.
I mean, it made promises to some of the countries during its imperial reign to like take care of them.
Essentially, it's a version of that, vitally. So essentially, they make promises, then they eventually lose the war. It's ultimately a form of reparations. Just as much as, I mean, so who historically has paid the bill for the EU? So the EU, I mean, now it's a little bit more equal. But historically, who cut the big, huge checks every year to cover all the EU subsidies, all the EU investment, all the EU structural adjustment funds, and so on and so forth? Germany. Did Germany do it because it was like, we're happy to do this. We're happy to spend $250 billion a year on this? No. It was because, well, you started 2 world wars and committed the Holocaust. Of course you're going to pay for it. But this is essentially Japan's version of reparations. And really only until, in Cambodia in particular, but many other countries, we really only can measure it until about 3 years ago that Japan was the largest donor, and now it's China. Huge shift. How big of a shift is this? The United States government is starting a new international finance corporation, the United States International Finance Corporation. It's going to be capitalized starting this year at $40 billion. That seems like a huge amount of money. That's a lot of cash. That will not come close to matching what China has on offer in terms of its ODA, in terms of simply its development assistance. That's the scale. That's how big it is. That's why we're looking at, and we're all debating, maybe we're moving into a period outside of unipolarity. If we measure polarity based on military strength, if we measure polarity based on economic strength, maybe things have changed. Maybe we are dealing with a revisionist power that's fundamentally seeking to alter the structure of global political equilibrium. It's doing big things. These are shifting. We're going to go a little bit more back into hegemony in Southeast Asia. Global, we've talked about it a little bit more, but we see China acting not simply within Southeast Asia. We see China acting most notoriously in Africa. We see China, and China's done, in many ways, China's done a great job in Africa. The West view of Africa has often been pretty insulting. It's been remarkably paternalistic. It's been basically, oh, it's just that place we send extra clothing and money. No, China basically viewed Africa and looked at it and said, there's a huge amount of investment here. There's enormous resources. We can build the roads, we can build the infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Now, there's been a very significant backlash to China's investment at many levels. But China's framed Africa in a way that's very different from the Western colonial mindset, and it's played a big role. China's also provided support for countries like Ecuador and countries like Venezuela, providing essentially tens of billions of dollars in loans in order to keep supporting those powers. China's also invested in countries like Serbia, Macedonia, Greece, Hungary. China's expansion into Eastern and Southern Europe has become so extensive that the European Union finally has begun to develop policy along those lines because they are concerned that China's influence in the EU has simply become too large. Again, that looks like a revisionist power. That looks to me like a shift out of unipolarity. So this is a huge deal. My favorite example, and this relates back to the documentary on the South China Sea, is the Arctic Council. Does anyone know what the Arctic Council is?
Isn't it like an organization of countries that surround like the Arctic Rim?
Precisely. Again, not a trick question. Arctic Council. It's a council of countries that deal with the Arctic Ocean. The countries that surround the Arctic Ocean include, we should know these, Russia, Norway,
Greenland.
Denmark,
Yeah.
yay, Canada, and,
China.
no,
The US.
United States. Alaska, it's a thing. I mean, we're Washington State, we're the gateway to Alaska, we should somewhat know this. Now, the Arctic Council, of course, is becoming more and more important because of broader questions of climate change and so on and so forth, possibilities of being able to ship throughout that region, possibilities of access in terms of natural resources and so on and so forth. So it's never really fully been charted out in terms of who officially owns what territory. China recently, about 2 years ago, asked for representation on the Arctic Council and said, okay, we really want, like, we deserve a seat. And went so far as if you go to Reykjavik, anyone ever been to Iceland? It's like the new hot thing. Everybody goes to Iceland now. It's not very nice. It's really expensive. But if you go to Reykjavik, one of the first things you'll see, it's a very small town. It's like going to a really big valley. It's a relatively small town. One of the first things you'll see when you go to Reykjavik is an enormous Chinese embassy. And one of the questions you ask is, what the heck could China be doing in Iceland? Seriously, I mean, why would you build an enormous embassy and staff it with a huge number of people? And China's argument was, we want to join the Arctic Council. And they trotted some argument out saying, 1,200 years ago, there was a Chinese explorer who first discovered the Arctic, and therefore China has a seat on this. Now, even for a multilateral organization, the response was sort of, I mean, a few raised eyebrows and a lot of like, really? Did you? Probably not. But the fact that China is going so far as to essentially search for hegemony in the Arctic is yet another piece of evidence that what we're ultimately seeing is a shift towards a global power, a global hegemon, that is ultimately acting in a measure that we would consider revisionist. Now, in order to understand whether it's revisionist, we have to go in and look at the question of the establishment of institutions. Now, the post-Cold War order is established by a particular set of institutions. We call those institutions the Bretton Woods institutions. These include, of course, our good friends, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and finally today, the WTO. China entered the WTO in 2001, and it has indeed flourished along those lines. But China's also begun to establish new institutions, new alternative institutions, such as we talked about them previously, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. What this does, at the end of the day, is it simply provides a fiscal alternative to going to the Asian Development Bank, run by Japan and the United States, or the World Bank, essentially run by the United States. In other words, what China's done is it really has gone ahead and created something of a competitor to the Bretton Woods institutions. At the same time, China's development policy has been instantiated through initially what we called OBOR, One Belt, One Road, E.U. Now we just call it BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative goes back to that question of China as a global power. The belt and roads are essentially designed to connect Southeast Asia, Europe, South Asia to China. These are designed to facilitate a massive expansion of Chinese exports, as well as to provide significant subsidized loans to build the roads, to build the railways that are necessary. What's the world's largest aid and development and investment program in the world today? This. That's it. The US is a massive global investor. Now, how big is the US economy? Trillions of dollars, ballpark. Oh, pretty close, pretty close. US GDP is $22 trillion per year. How many assets does the United States have abroad?
Including like military bases.
Just investment. $80 trillion. That's massive in terms of the sheer size of the US economy. That's just the US economy. That's not the US military and so on and so forth. That's a huge economy. And China's rapidly catching up to that. Again, this goes right to the question of debate. Is China a revisionist power? Is China a status quo power? China will be the first country to say, no, China is not a revisionist power. China is a status quo power, but it's a power that feels that it has the right to go back and to begin to fundamentally consider the fact that it has historically been the regional hegemon. And this is the big, huge question for Southeast Asia. Have the last 150 to 200 years simply been one big historical anomaly? Short period of time. For 2,000 years, with the exception of those 200 or so, China has been the regional hegemon in Southeast Asia. Why would we consider the last 200 years to be some special magical change that's going to result in some sort of shift? Not necessarily. So this is again I would say, if this is clearly the most important question in Southeast Asia, but this is also possibly one of the 5 most important, if not the most important question in contemporary international relations. That is why we care so much. Other reasons that we care enormously. Let me just get to 5G, et cetera, first, and military modernization, before we move on to the break and then to the South China Sea. Military modernization. So China has been, since the last early 2000s, has engaged in significant investment in its military. Particularly building up its land forces, its naval forces, its missile forces, its nuclear forces, and so on and so forth. China's even, of course, gone to the Russians, and basically China is building a project to go to the moon. We're going to talk about that in a minute. China today is increasingly able to defend itself. This is where we're going to go to the little map in a second. But it also relates to building such a space technology and so on and so forth in 5G. What is 5G and why do we care? Who's the leading company of China in charge of building 5G technology? You should know it. Well, thank God we know it. If you build 5G, you're essentially building on a particular bandwidth. 5G and whatever 5G network you adopt will ultimately determine the type of 3D printing that you use, the development of artificial intelligence, the future development of production. And right now, essentially, there's a war going on between the US and China as to who gets to build 5G. Will it be Google and Apple, or will it be Huawei? How bitter is this fight? The US arrested the daughter of the founder of Huawei, who's now sitting in British Columbia. That's about as harsh as it gets, as we're serious. We don't want you to build. The US runs an active campaign against Huawei, heavily pressuring allies to basically ban the use of Huawei. Australia has, Britain has, quite a few others have, and China's the exact same thing. About a month ago, anyone ever heard of, there's a lovely little place in the North Atlantic called the Faroe Islands, F-A-R-O-E. Anyone heard of these? Who owns them? Denmark. They're gorgeous. There's like a little fishing village, there's 60,000 people, it's windswept, it's charming. And the Chinese ambassador to Denmark, who is also the ambassador to the Faroe Islands, was caught. The governor of the Faroe Islands actually kind of like turned his phone on and recorded him. And the Chinese ambassador basically said to the governor of the Faroe Islands, accept this right now, sign this treaty, accept that we will basically be the ones building this, or we're cutting off all aid, all trade, all investment. Sign it and sign it now. That's a lot more than exerting pressure. This made a huge scandal in Denmark. It's hard to make scandals in Denmark. But this was a fairly huge scandal for Denmark. But this goes to not just the question of, okay, care about 5G and so on and so forth, What this goes to is, and that this is increasingly also a global competition. And Southeast Asia is the impetus for this broader global competition. Final point, just looking at sort of how important this is. And again, every single thing I've written on the board is vocabulary that's fair play, and is vocabulary that you should know. So if there's terminology that's unclear, please do get to know it. You need to be able to talk about these things utilizing the technical vocabulary, because that's how, again, conceptualization is quite important. Anyone see the thing with the Space Force last week? They were roundly mocked. What is the Space Force? It's always the target of comedy. It's always somebody on social media or David Letterman talking about, we're building a Space Force, which does, to be honest, sound like it's something that comes out of if you ever had like G.I. Joe or any of that when you were a kid. It sounds totally G.I. Joe. So what is Space Force? Why do we care? Should we care?
The U.S. is like building branch of the military that's like developed for space.
Essentially. So and the best way to understand is we compare it all the way back to, please tell me who left me this. Whoever takes this room previously really likes to hide these things. And the best way to analyze it and to understand this. So one of the reasons the U.S. is so insanely powerful in Southeast Asia, and this will lead us into the break and into the South China Sea, is the fact that the United States has what we call, we've talked about this, a blue water navy. What's a blue water navy?
It's a navy that's fit for crossing oceans.
Yeah, exactly. You can go anywhere, and it's really developed by this guy, one of the most important naval strategists ever to come out of the United States, a guy by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's the guy that really creates American imperial policy. He's Theodore Roosevelt's favorite author. If you're trying to understand the history of U.S. military power, read this guy. And Alfred Thayer Mahan talks about a blue water navy. In other words, a water that can sail, a navy that can sail into blue water, unlike water along the coast, which is green or brown and so on and so forth. And historically, the strength of the U.S. as it regards the South China Sea is the U.S. has a global blue water navy. I mean, we don't just have a fleet, we have fleets that have numbers on them, because there's 14 of them. The 7th fleet is the one we care about for Southeast Asia. Now to go back to the Space Force, the guy who's heading it, I was on a panel, I was at a closed door briefing circle session with him at the US Capitol in September. Fascinating guy. And the parallel he said is, let me explain what's going on. The US is building a green water Space Force. We deal with satellites, we can do all of that. China's building a blue water approach to space. What that ultimately means is all those fun little satellites that the US that kind of run communications, all of those become vulnerable. All of that becomes essentially something that can be destroyed in minutes, which destroys defense capability, which destroys all security. So we all like to make fun of the Space Force because, again, it's a stupid name. But in terms of the enormous impact that this has, it's impossible to overstate. The U.S. this year estimated that China's civilian spending on, or rather military spending on Space Force stuff alone was over $300 billion. We didn't even know how much spent otherwise. The U.S., less than $40 billion. This again goes to a question of a serious revisionist power and so on and so forth. All right. With that as preface, and these are the primary issues, when we come back from the break, sorry I went so long, you can tell I kind of care about this. I want to go through initially, first, major themes and major thoughts from the great Rupert Wingfield Hayes, and what he shared with us about the South China Sea. Why do we care about this issue? Why is this so important, and why is this such an incredible security threat to the region as a whole? So it's 224 or so let's come back to 229.